Hello. Today I'll be presenting a USENIX Security Symposium 2019 paper, Looking from the Mirror, Evaluating IoT Device Security Through Mobile Companion Apps. This paper was done in collaboration between Indiana University Bloomington and Symantec Research Labs, and it's being presented by Ryan Fulkerson. The authors of this paper hypothesized that it is possible to assess the security posture of an IoT device by observing its reflection. In this analogy, the mirror which provides such a reflection is the device's mobile companion app. This method is free, publicly available, and generates a faithful enough depiction of the device to perform a security analysis. So let's discuss the core problem laid out by this team of researchers. And the problem is actually twofold. First, smart home IoT security is lacking industry-wide. This is an economics-driven problem. In this industry, the vendors are small or medium-sized, and there is little to no budget often for software QA or security review. Insecure devices are not the exception, rather they are ubiquitous. The devices are often inexpensive, less than $100, and there is little margin for additional security features such as microcontrollers with adequate cryptographic accelerators or dedicated security hardware such as coprocessors. Security is often seen as a trade-off for convenience and ease of use. And finally, there is little incentive for remediation. Once a device ships, the vendor has little incentive and little capability to patch it. Fragmented distribution means updates cannot reliably reach the install base. And as a consequence, a huge long-lived population of devices that are attackable, worth attacking, and effectively unmaintained. Mirai Botnet is an example of such a consequence facilitated by this industry environment and the economic reality. The second part of this problem is the current state of vulnerable device discovery methods. In this slide, the pros and cons of two primary vulnerability research methods are discussed. The first is internet-wide scanning. In this method, the public internet is swept for vulnerable devices. This could be because of default credentials, weak keys, or weak certificates. Shodan is an ideal tool for this purpose, with lots of resources available to inform research methods. But it has its shortcomings. In this method, you can't see devices behind network address translation, and that is the majority of smart home devices. Additionally, it only catches shallow bugs, misconfigurations. Sophisticated flaws are invisible to a port scan. The second approach is device and firmware analysis. In this method, the device is obtained or its firmware image is obtained. It's then scanned statically or dynamically, and as a result, you have an accurate, thorough, and industry standard method for vulnerability discovery. However, this too has its shortcomings. Devices cost money and are often unavailable outside their home market. Firmware is often not published or publicly available. And in some cases, even with firmware on hand, packing, obfuscation, and encryption methods hinder analysis efforts. So what you have here is a wide and shallow versus deep and narrow situation. Neither method of vulnerability assessment provides both the desired depth and scale required for valuable coverage of a market of thousands of device vendors. And so you have a perspective gap, market-wide device vulnerability triage. Prospective device customers or security researchers would benefit from a way to narrow the field of IoT devices, to be able to apply time and cost-intensive research methods before deployment, when there is still time to segment, block, patch, or even refuse to buy devices. Such a methodology would have requirements. It must work without the physical device. It must work without the firmware image available. And the method must scale to thousands of models across hundreds of vendors. What the researchers in this paper were after is an alternative, affordable, and scalable approach to device vulnerability discovery. The authors of this paper present such a method specifically for the IoT device product category as a whole. However, it would behoove participants of other industries and government sectors to evaluate the merits of this method for cyber-physical device security analysis. But more on that at the end of this presentation. And thus, the researchers arrive at a solution to their problem through two key observations. The first is that vendors reuse each other's parts. That is, open source, popular commercial software, microcontrollers, networking SoCs, memory modules from common suppliers, shared protocols, shared cloud backends, and outright rebranding of another vendor's device. As a result, a vulnerability discovered in one device may be present in many. The second key observation is that the reuse shows up in the app. The companion app interfaces with the device, so it must speak the device's protocols, know its available ports, hold its keys, and configure its hardware. Reuse of device components is reflected by similarities between the companion apps. Additionally, the companion apps are readily available for analysis as they reside in a public store, free to download. The common use of hardware and software components among IoT devices makes certain vulnerabilities another potential commonality. The app is another available surface for reconnaissance, where the component and vulnerability commonalities can become visible. And the novel method developed works as follows. Similarity is measured between apps. Then similarity between devices is inferred. Finally, researchers are able to propagate what is already known about a vulnerable device to other devices which share inferred similarities. Now, there are two distinct perspectives from which the researcher's methodology can be used. First is the device view. Given a particular IoT device, which vulnerabilities might it have? This is useful for procurement, asset inventory, risk assessment of something already on a network. The second view is the threat view. Given a particular vulnerability, which devices on the market might have it? This is useful for incident response, vulnerability disclosure, and asset fleet management. Now, ideally, the methodology creates credible comparisons between devices which have not been directly obtained or observed. Note that this paper uses the threat view perspective in its analyses. So, how does this method work exactly? The researchers call their tool and methodology the platform, and it basically works like so. First, the platform crawls through the Google Play Store for IoT device companion apps. Then, an analyzing engine examines the apps, creating a device profile from the features and components observed or inferred in the app analysis. Third, a cross-app analysis is performed, which results in the formation of device family clusters. These clusters are organized by features and components shared between the devices. Finally, case studies are performed on curated known vulnerabilities to observe how device families can share vulnerabilities inherited by their shared components. Note that the platform also uses a firmware collector, which gathers firmware from endpoints disclosed during app analysis. This firmware is only used for validating their platform's results and is not actually part of the platform's vulnerability matching engine. This is a figure from the researcher's paper, and it goes over their platform in a little bit more granular detail. You can see here the Google Play Store, an app database, an app analysis engine, which is broken down into three components. There's an app analysis database, which is used for the cross-app analysis, which then results in device family clusters. Finally, at the bottom here, you can see that from app signature analysis, firmware URLs are extracted, which are passed to a device firmware collector. This device firmware database stores the firmware for the validation method used by the researchers. In developing the app dataset for their methodology, the researchers had to overcome a challenge. That is, how do you obtain relevant IoT device companion apps at scale? To solve this, 281 known good apps were handpicked from Smart Home DB. Then snowball sampling was applied to a set of seed apps, and through Play Store keywords, categories, and suggestions, 3,094 apps were obtained. The problem is that this dragged in lookalike apps. For example, phone cam apps were mistaken for security camera apps, and screen lock apps were mistaken for smart locks. So to resolve this, a filter was applied, which clustered apps by requested mobile device permissions that were requested, and various sensitive Android API calls. Finally, a manual check of 200 of the filtered apps revealed 98.5% were genuine IoT companion apps. This left researchers with a final companion app dataset of 2,081 unique apps. Now let's dive into their research methodology and what they meant by looking through the mirror a bit further. The app and the device are treated as two halves of one conversation. So the researchers worked backwards from the available half to infer characteristics of the other half. They started with the app communication protocols. They set out to find code that handles incoming network messages. Whatever the app is prepared to receive is, by definition, what the device will be communicating. Then they worked back to what the app says. They reconstructed requests that would provoke that response. Note that often requests and responses lived in different classes or on different execution threads. What they were left with was a fingerprint, a set of request-response pairs, ports, and endpoints, or a portrait of a device without direct probing, sniffing, or eavesdropping. In an example that they shared in the paper, a Zengi Wi-Fi bulb companion app was studied to determine a TCP port, UDP port, and a cloud relay endpoint. And note that this information was discovered without purchasing a bulb or obtaining its firmware. The researchers still determined what it speaks, where it listens, and whose cloud it phones home to. For the platform's app analysis engine, the researchers used three primary signals. The first are interfaces, and that is what ports or protocols the device listens on and how it answers. This is the most complete and the most informative signal. Additionally, they used imprints. This supporting signal is essentially distinctive strings within the app to talk to the device. This could be hard-coded keys, backdoor keywords, account passwords, and private URLs. And finally, the researchers used code similarity for their app analysis engine, and this was accomplished through fuzzy hashing across app internals. They used SSDeep, which allows for evaluation of app similarity, where traditional hashing through SHA-1, for example, could not do. Note that this signal fails to relate similar devices which have unsimilar apps. The results from the app analysis engine are measured per module rather than per app, and this is an important distinction. A device is an assembly of distinct hardware and software components, so the analysis must resolve to the component level. For example, the high-flying Wi-Fi module is alluded to in Be Smart Thermostat's app as its own distinct class, separate from the thermostat's own logic. That helps determine that other apps with such classes indicate that their respective devices share a Wi-Fi chip, as opposed to merely observing that these two apps appear similar in parts of their logic. Through cross-app analysis, the researchers were able to create a set of device family clusters. Now, these clusters of devices from different vendors share a component. Vulnerabilities are potentially shared within families. So the researchers identified 5 key dimensions that could result in a family or device cluster. This could be a shared backend service, a shared protocol, the fact that a device was a rebranding. It could be shared software or shared hardware components. Note that some of the families overlap, and the device families vary in size. The largest device family is comprised of 31 vendors, where the smallest family was comprised of only 2. Now let's move on to the results obtained by the researchers. And before we discuss them in too much detail, it's important to discuss the validation of the researchers' methodology or their platform. The platform outputs conjectures about the vulnerabilities a device may inherit through its component bill of materials. Remember, that can be software or hardware. A vulnerability conjecture may or may not actually equate to a device being vulnerable to a given CVE. However, validation of this methodology reveals how effectively it can predict true device vulnerabilities. Now, this validation was accomplished with 4 different methodologies. The first was to obtain the actual device. This was the gold standard, but it's expensive, and so it was used sparingly. The second was to emulate or statically analyze firmware, where it was actually obtained. This, of course, depended on whether or not the firmware could be obtained, but where it could, it was heavily utilized. Third, researchers corroborated public reports. And this could be from vendor manuals, bug forums, or hacking communities. This was also heavily used to validate results. The fourth and final method was to reach out to the vendor. Now, this was attempted, but researchers mostly went unanswered in their queries to vendors. The authors referred to it as a black hole. Note that the 2 methods that the researchers leaned on the hardest are the 2 which never touch the vendor or the device. That lends itself to the scalability of this method. Another important thing to discuss is the methodology ethics that were employed by the researchers. They ensured that devices tested on isolated LANs had outbound connections only, and that devices were taken offline immediately after testing. Additionally, the scope of real-world vulnerability impact was estimated from existing Shodan scans, so no active scanning was performed during the researchers' efforts. And finally, findings were disclosed to affected vendors in a responsible manner. Now let's discuss some of the results by the numbers. In total, 2,081 companion apps were analyzed. That covered 1,345 device vendors and 4,720 total device models. The researchers estimated that this only covered about 5 to 20% of the total IoT companion apps in existence. Their platform flagged 324 device models from 73 vendors as potentially vulnerable. Of that, 164 device models from 38 vendors were actually confirmed vulnerable after the researchers' validation methods were applied. All in all, researchers estimated that 11.1 million users are using vulnerable devices discovered from this study. The researchers demonstrated their platform through case studies of how vulnerabilities can be shared through various dimensions of device similarity. In this first case study, shared software was used to infer device vulnerability to 5 publicly known CVEs. These CVEs are related to Go-Ahead, which is a small embedded web server. Countless IoT devices use it to serve their admin interface. And in 2017, it drew 5 CVEs related to authentication bypass, a backdoor account, and remote code execution. To start with, a seed device, the Neo CoolCam IP camera, was chosen, which is already known to be vulnerable. Then, through cross-app analysis, 72 device models across 16 vendors were determined to share that software. Finally, it was confirmed that 52 models across 8 vendors were verified vulnerable to one of the 5 CVEs. This includes 7 models from 4 vendors which were not previously reported. A search of Shodan revealed that 58,000 456 devices are still exposed and unpatched 2 years after the CVEs were published. Now, the researchers noted a false positive in this case study, K-Guard. Analysis through manual device inspection and firmware emulation revealed the devices were not vulnerable. The 3 K-Guard devices were determined to not be vulnerable to any of the 5 CVEs despite being flagged by the platform, likely due to the fact that they were relatively new devices, and their developers were possibly aware of the publicly disclosed vulnerabilities. In a second case study, the researchers showed how a device's rebranding status can be an indicator of inherited vulnerability to known CVEs. Consider this timeline. Before July 2017, XiaoFeng ships a stack buffer overflow in its embedded web server. The impact surface is distributed across 8+ firmware versions and at least 15 models. Then in July of 2017, XiaoFeng quietly patched the vulnerability. No CVE, no advisory. In 2018, the same bug is reported as CVE 2018-11560, but occurring in the Insteon IP camera. Here's the catch. Insteon 2864-222 is a rebranded XiaoFeng FI8918W. The same hardware, the same software, but a different label. The bug was inherited, but the fix was not. This goes to show that remediation of one device does not propagate to downstream rebrand projects. And a search on Shodan showed that 30.7% of XiaoFeng cameras visible on Shodan were still running unpatched firmware. 27 more rebranded device families were discovered from the researchers' app dataset. This is an area that future validation work could be applied to further study vulnerability inheritance through rebranding. The researchers highlighted 3 additional case studies which show other dimensions by which vulnerabilities can be shared across hardware. The first is shared hardware. Wi-Fi modules that leak your Wi-Fi. The high-flying SmartLink NESP Touch provisioning broadcasted home network credentials over an observable side channel. Of 166 devices and 35 vendors flagged by the platform, 67 devices and 16 vendors were confirmed to be vulnerable. Another dimension is shared protocol. The researchers discussed devices that secretly speak SSDP. This protocol is a known DDoS reflector. In this situation, a small query returns a larger amplified response, and few vendors document that their devices actually speak this protocol. In their study, 39 devices and 11 vendors were flagged, and 18 devices and 6 vendors were confirmed to be vulnerable. This represented a user base that was made up of 10.2 million app downloads. And finally, the third dimension studied was a shared backend. The researchers discussed a cloud service with 6-digit device IDs. In this study, shared IoT backend services register devices with 6-digit ITs. This is trivially brute forceable. Of 32 devices and 10 vendors flagged by the platform, 12 devices and 7 vendors were actually confirmed to be vulnerable. Keep in mind that none of these are actually software bugs. The methods observe parts of the device and its design which the vendor may not have documented and the customer rarely notices. Finally, the researchers discussed some miscellaneous findings. These weren't exactly vulnerabilities in the devices, but shortcomings in the design philosophy of the IoT device manufacturers. The first was a confused trust model. Device manufacturers distrusted the networks in which their devices were used, but they trusted the apps wholly. Researchers encountered situations where developers would encrypt the app's LAN traffic and then ship the app with hard-coded keys inside. In this case, anyone with an APK and a disassembler can obtain the security secrets. For example, the TP-Link HS110 smart plug, the encryption used was merely an XOR operation that was applied to the message, against the constant 171, and the key was baked into the app. In another example, the D-Link water sensor, the app authenticates with fixed credentials that the user cannot change. The other observation was convenient provisioning, and this demonstrated a convenience versus security trade-off, which is a timeless classic. So headless devices also need your Wi-Fi password, and the industry has drifted from interactive methods of wireless network authentication for devices, AP mode, WPS, Bluetooth for example, towards more hands-off methods where credentials are merely supplied by the user. This could be smart config or SoundWave. These require the use of a side channel to carry the credential. The side channel is often publicly observable, which can result in leaks. Usability and convenience is bought at the price of the security robustness. Now let's discuss the methodology and platform effectiveness and accuracy. The key value reported by the researchers is that 50.6% of devices that the platform flagged as vulnerable were confirmed to be vulnerable through validation methods. That's a rate of about 1/2. Another key statistic is that 91.6% of devices that were validated as vulnerable were actually found to be vulnerable in the end. This means that 8.4% turned out to be false positives. There were 4 main sources of the false positives. The first is silent patch. Devices could be fixed, but the app would remain unchanged. In this case, the mirror does not reflect the patched device. Another reason is dead code. An app could contain code which is not actually used by the companion device or the application during normal use. A third reason for false positives is attribution limits. In one case, a single app controls many devices. Researchers could not tell which device uses which parts of the interface. And finally, and this is perhaps obvious, but the application is not a perfect analogy for the device. In one example, the Bixby gesture controller, the app speaks SSDP, but the device doesn't, leading to the false positive. In their final assessment of the researchers' methodology, they discuss where their tool, the platform, breaks down. First, a patch that's invisible to the companion app is invisible to the method. Second, cloud-mediated devices, for example, from Google or Amazon, often decouple the app from the device. The mirror becomes less useful the more the cloud backend is relied upon. And finally, the seed vulnerabilities are still collected and fed to the platform by hand, i.e. the case studies. Automatic vulnerability search and collection systems would greatly enhance the utility of this platform. And the researchers also discuss what they would propose instead for a better architecture, and this is a 2-stage one. In the first stage, which would be cheap, broad, and imprecise, they refer to the platform itself that they showed in the paper. This stage narrows down the device environment from thousands of devices to dozens. In the second stage, which would be more expensive, narrow, and rigorous, researchers would use firmware analysis, emulation, and device penetration and fuzz testing. In other words, the platform proposed in this paper serves as a starting point for researchers or professionals or device customers. Then, other validated methods of security assessments can take over and provide more security granularity and precision to decision makers. Finally, we'll discuss the question, does this methodology generalize? In my mind, the main contribution of this research is in the resourcefulness and scalability of their methodology. So it begs the question, is it applicable to other industries and domains? Consider these 2 preconditions, which could determine applicability of this method to other domains. The first, do vendors in other domains reuse components across products? Where this holds, one device bug may be compounded to many bugs. The second precondition is that researchers could find some cheap, obtainable artifact which mirrors the device, such as the companion app for IoT devices. In the smart home, that's a Play Store app, but it does not necessarily have to be an app in other industries or domains. Consider 3 additional domains in which the researcher's methodology and platform could be generalized to. These are commercial and smart office, medical devices, and industrial and utilities environments. In the first, commercial and smart office, both conditions are met, as this environment is largely similar to smart homes. In this environment, you have building automation, access control, and IP cameras, and the rebranding problem is possibly worse in this setting. However, security policies are more likely to exist in this setting, which would add an interesting dynamic to a study. In medical devices, including patient-facing companion apps like continuous glucose monitors, pumps, and cardiac monitors, these sit in public app stores. However, regulation impacts the availability of information about device components, which may actually improve the efficacy of this methodology. And finally, in industrial and utilities environments, I believe the first precondition is met in that device manufacturers probably reuse a lot of commercially available open source components. However, the availability of a mirror artifact isn't immediately clear, but it would be an interesting investigation in future work. It's also worth briefly noting that there's a unique value add for similar methodologies like the platform in safety critical domains. So in these types of environments, it's not always easy to do the things which this method replaces. For example, you can't take the device offline to test it. You can't actively scan a live treatment plant. You can't fuzz an energized substation, or single actors can't buy one of everything to test. In fact, in many industrial applications, equipment is not portable. Availability and safety are the top-line requirements, and nearly every conventional assessment technique can threaten both of those things. So the value of a passive or indirect or non-invasive security assessment is almost directly related to the system safety criticality. The researchers in this paper paint such a methodology as affordable and scalable, but within industrial and utilities settings, it may also prove to be a safer one. Now, a major caveat is that a 50% precision for the tool is fine for consumer device triage. In a hospital or on a grid, false positives could lead to unwarranted recalls or needless and disruptive downtime. And false negatives, meanwhile, can have disastrous results in the worst case. So this method cannot be used as the final word for a security assessment, but it could be used as part of a multifaceted approach, like the two-stage architecture the authors proposed. Well, that concludes the presentation, so thank you for taking the time to follow along with it, and I hope you found it educational. Cheers.